85,000 men. Two armies face against each other. This is the valley of Dien Bien Phu, and the battle that takes place here will decide the fate of the region. The outcome of this battle rests on the decisions of one man. During the onset of the Cold War, this man shocked the world by mobilizing a third world nation against a first world empire. By standing for justice and sovereignty, he is remembered as one of the greatest generals of the 20th century. Vo Nguyen Giap was born on August 25, 1911 in Nang Sa Quang Binh Province, one of the most impoverished regions of Vietnam. At the time, the modern countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were all colonial territories as French Indochina. Under the French, the locals were often subject to injustice, brutality, and exploitation.
Under the French rule, the Vietnamese have no democratic voice. The Allies, they had proclaimed that they were fighting to protect democracy and they're fighting for freedom against fascism. And yet, these very same Allied powers are depriving their colonies of democracy and freedom.
The people here suffered a lot because of high taxes and hard forced labor. They worked from dawn till dusk, but they did not have enough to eat.
At a young age, Giap's father, Vo Quang Nghiêm, would tell him tales of Vietnamese generals who stood against the Chinese and Mongols. Giap aspired to be like them and developed a deep, profound love for his nation.
Even from a very young age, he was known for being very curious, very intelligent, very studious.
Noticing this, Nghiêm sent his son to study at the Lycée National College. At the college, his nationalism prompted him to join an anti-colonialism movement. However, after organizing a student strike against the French, he was expelled. Afterward, Giap began studying at the University of Hanoi, becoming well-versed in the arts of politics and warfare. Giap drew inspiration from the French Revolution and Napoleon, whom he deeply admired. His intense lectures on these subjects earned him the nickname the Red Napoleon.
He was very involved in social issues in the 1930s. It opened up more possibilities for writing, for publishing newspapers, more critical of colonial powers. And this is something which radicalized him. I would say the first type of radicalization was nationalism. So he made that kind of leftward journey towards communism.
Giap joined the Indochinese Communist Party in 1930 due to the party's opposition to French rule, and also inspired many of his colleagues to stand against the French. He wanted freedom for Vietnam, but was he truly a communist?
Were people like Vo Nguyen Giap, were they really communists or were they nationalists? Some people see the two as incompatible. The answer is they were both. They were ardent nationalists who wanted to end French colonial rule, and they viewed communism as the best formula, the best method for achieving this goal. The communists emerged as the most effective anti-colonial force, and as you might imagine, the French weren't interested in that.
In 1939, France outlawed communism. Many Vietnamese communists, including Giap, abandoned their families and fled to China. While in China, Giap met and befriended Ho Quan, also known as Ho Chi Minh. In 1941, amidst the Second World War, Ho Chi Minh formed the Viet Minh, which sought Vietnamese independence. Well-versed in warfare and trusted comrade of Ho Chi Minh, Giap became a charter member of the Viet Minh and was tasked to construct its military force despite lacking sufficient resources and experience.
He wasn't the intellectual that Ho Chi Minh was, or some of the other leaders, but he was the doer. He was the guy that got things done.
After the surrender of Japan in World War II, the Viet Minh rushed to Hanoi and became the provisional government of Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh left for France to negotiate independence, while Giap oversaw the administration of the state and its army. The French refused to cede their colonial possessions in Indochina, imposing more stringent controls on their properties. To ensure the suppression of any rebellion, the French shelled the city of Haiphong to instill fear. Thus, December 1946 saw the incipience of the First Indochina War.
The Viet Minh forces, of course, they didn't have the weapons, they didn't have the equipment that the French did, they didn't have the training. The French used to refer to the Viet Minh as the barefoot army, as though the soldiers didn't even own proper footwear, never mind armaments.
Given the circumstances, Giap was a firm believer in protracted warfare. To him, patience was key to victory against a superior force. It can stretch resources and morale. He also placed great emphasis on securing the loyalty of the locals, for without it, victory was impossible. By earning the trust of Vietnamese peasants, the Viet Minh obtained a dependable source of supplies, intelligence, and manpower. Farmers were drafted to carry artillery, cyclists delivered supplies, and soldiers trained in the countryside.
La principale force de notre armée réside dans le moral, dans l'esprit combatif du soldat et dans le soutien illimitée de la population. Et puis, dans la technique, deux facteurs. Le facteur primordial, facteur moral. Alors nous sommes fiers d'être du moral élevé de notre armée. Maintenant, c'est de la population.
After his time in China, Giap learned and mastered Mao Zedong's 3 stages of revolutionary warfare: organization through fortification, consolidation, and recruitment, progressive expansion through guerrilla warfare, and decisive destruction of the enemy through an all-out frontal assault. Against a numerically and technically superior enemy, conventional warfare was impossible. However, small victories in each of these stages culminate to create a military force capable of engaging the enemy in battle. For 7 years, Giap conducted guerrilla warfare with moderate success. However, in 1950, the Viet Minh suffered devastating losses in the Battle of the Red River Delta. Nearly 20,000 men were lost. Throughout the war, several Viet Minh leaders were skeptical of Giap's methods, especially his willingness to sacrifice his men. In response, Giap said, "Every minute, hundreds of thousands of people die on this earth. The life or death of 100, 1,000, tens of thousands of human beings, even our compatriots, means little." He understood that victory came at a great price, and often reminded his men that the cause was ultimately more important than individual lives. Victory meant an independent Vietnam, forever free from foreign control.
The big moment came in with the communist victory in China. Suddenly there was a major communist power right across the border, and a whole new world of opportunities open for the Viet Minh to draw political and material support. All of the great powers increasingly saw the fighting in Indochina as a manifestation of the Cold War rather than as what it had seemed just a few years before, as a classic confrontation between a colonial power and anti-colonial nationalism. It was both things simultaneously.
Giap had prolonged the war for 8 years, and French public opinion had long faltered. General Henri Navarre, seeking a decisive victory, chose to fortify at Dien Bien Phu, a valley near the Viet Minh's Lao Shan supply lines. He hoped to exploit the rugged terrain to create an impenetrable natural defense. Thousands of troops from the French army's elite and Foreign Legion parachuted into the area.
There was a French artillery officer, and he assured his superiors that the Viet Minh would, even if they did get artillery in the area, they would only be able to get off 3 rounds of artillery before the French identified the location of the Viet Minh artillery, returned fire, and destroyed it. So he guaranteed 3 rounds from the enemy and I will destroy them. Guaranteed.
Unbeknownst to the French, Giap and his men had acquired heavy artillery and had begun moving in on the garrison.
After in-depth analysis of the latest information, I realized that such an attack was not 100% sure of success. One of the fundamental rules, if not the most fundamental rule of Vietnamese military science, is that in war, you must win.
On March 13, 1954, Giap's men surrounded and besieged the French base with 105mm guns. By the 5th day, the stronghold's outer fortifications had already fallen, and numerous French troops were deserting. The siege continued for 56 days until the French were finally overwhelmed by the endless bombardment. The French surrendered on May 7, 1954. The First Indochina War was over. After over 60 years under French rule, the Vietnamese were finally free. After the war, Giap became a national hero and was tasked to calm the people and restore order in the newly independent Vietnam. He declared, "In the past, our greatest challenge was the invasion of our nation by foreigners. Now that Vietnam is independent and united, we can address our biggest challenge. That challenge is poverty and economic backwardness." Giap is often regarded as a controversial figure. To many, he was a ruthless killer who was cruel to his enemies and his own men. Yet, it is undeniable that he took a stand for his ideas, his beliefs, his country. He stood against imperialism and exploitation. He stood against the French. He wasn't a soldier, he was a fervent nationalist turned general. He is honored as the architect of the People's Army of Vietnam and a master strategist of guerrilla warfare. However, within decades, Indochina became a powder keg for the Second Indochina War, the Vietnam War. Caught in the crossroads of the age of imperialism and the Cold War, Giap secured Vietnam's independence, allowing it to develop and thrive. His actions and those of many others like him would precipitate into the gradual unraveling of the European colonial empires.